Welcome to the Thought Decoders Podcast. Today I'm joined by Professor Chris Wolfe. We're decoding the politics of war. Stay tuned. We're back. Welcome, Dr. Chris. Dr. Chris, Professor Chris, Christopher Wolfe. You have so many aliases that the right one didn't.
It's all right, Professor Sean.
So I'll just go with Chris. It saves me things to remember during this interview. But it's a pleasure to have you back with us. For those of you who are joining us, Chris is a professor of politics. Is that the professor of politics?
Political science. Yeah.
Political science. And he has worked in this field. He's been academic for several years now. I was thinking about the Ukraine war. I was thinking about the Israel-Hamas war. And I had several questions about NATO and international law and basically just like the politics of war. And I said, who could I bring on who would have expertise in it? And the thought occurred to me, it's like, Tommy, you know someone.
A little bit.
And so I'm glad to have you on. Thanks for joining us again. How are you?
I'm good. It's been a great semester. I got to teach my class on the presidency this semester here at the University of St. Thomas. And so that's my main intersection with the war powers of the president and talking about foreign policy that way.
Okay. So we have a list of questions here. And as I was thinking to myself, let's just go point by point and see if we can illuminate some answers on these questions. I'll be the one asking the questions, of course, and you will be the one illuminating the audience. So let's get started with Ukraine. Russia invades Ukraine. However, Russia also, they have publicly condemned Israel's strikes on Gaza because those strikes have led to the deaths of civilians.
Mm-hmm.
In light of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, how is it consistent of Russia to condemn Israel for their retaliatory strikes in Gaza?
That's a little bit ironic, isn't it? That we know that they've done some strikes that have killed Ukrainian civilians, but then they're denouncing the Israelis for that. Oddly enough, Sean, I've actually, last summer I was in Israel. This past, 2023 summer, and then summer before that, I was in Poland, where tons of Ukrainian refugees were coming in. So my parents say, Chris, like, where are you going to go next summer? And remind me not to go there because there might be a war that gets started there. But so my perspective on this, besides what I said, I can talk a lot about American foreign policy from the presidency perspective. I'm also a Catholic Christian, and so I think about it in terms of the just war theory, and so I do think it was an unjust war that Russia started when it invaded Ukraine, but
and why is that?
Well, there's two main principles that just war theory talks in terms of is the cause of the war that you're starting a just cause, and second of all, is the conduct of your military in the war just or not? So are you killing civilians? That's what they call jus in bello, the conduct of war. That's one set of questions. Then the earlier set of questions in starting the war, that's called jus ad bellum, the justice of the cause of the war. And so usually the just cause, it needs to be an act of self-defense, usually, if you're going to do a war. Um, there's some other criteria, even if there is, if you're not the aggressor, uh, there are actually other considerations for why you might not want to go to war, that just war theory for hundreds of years has talked about. Um, First of all, do you have a prospect of success if you do the war? Second
Hmm.
of all, have
Success
all
meaning.
diplomatic peaceful means been exhausted? Third, is there lasting, grave, certain damage that's going to be done if you don't go to war? And
And would
so,
success be determined by the goals of your war? For example, like Israel says their goal is to wipe out Hamas. That's
mhm.
one, and to bring back all of the hostages. So if it's not likely that they can achieve that, then they shouldn't attempt. So
That's what natural law and the just war theory would say is, yeah, you
okay.
have to think about, is it an achievable goal
So
that
let's
would
take
be moral to do?
Ukraine for an example. I've heard some uh, pundits, political pundits, generals, and whatnot, different political leaders on several different news stations on their channels on YouTube. They've said things like, "There's no way Ukraine can win. That it's just a matter of time before Russia, completely wipes out all the Ukrainians and takes over the land." So does just war require the Ukrainians to stop fighting? Or when someone says, "Well, we're going to defend until the death," is that an
Mhm.
unjust uh, decision? What do you think about that?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. I mean, it does seem like sometimes the right thing would be to fight to the death. If it's the Nazis and Hitler, um, it's just not the alternative in terms of maybe taking an L, taking a defeat, and giving up land. Uh, Sometimes that seems like it might be worth it in order to get peace,
Mm-hmm.
to have some kind of compromise. But at other times, you shouldn't compromise, and that's I think the question there, um, and
Okay.
some of that's prudential,
And
and
so the Russian, going back to the causes of the war as a basis of what makes the war just or not. I heard Vladimir Putin say mention that many of the citizens of Russian descent who were in Ukraine were being mistreated and uh, you know, whether that was denied resources or not, he didn't really say. And but the I guess the picture, the suggestion is that this is one reason they invaded. Do you know what the what the Russians say about as far as their reason for invading
sure,
Ukraine?
that Donbass region, there's a very complicated history to Ukraine, just like there's a very very complicated history to Israel. To be honest with
Wow.
you, there's a book called Bloodlands, which talks
Wow.
about this region, that it's just had war after war after war, going back to Genghis Khan invasion. Uh, but basically, I know some of this from reading a lot of Polish history, but basically, at one point, Ukraine was part of a large empire along with Poland and also Lithuania. And it was a huge region. And then you had Russia over here and then Germany on the other side. Um, in the course of the 1800s, they Poland basically disappeared from the map. Germany took over part of it. Austria took over part of it. Russia took over part of it. and Ukraine then became part of Russia. And so the borders have fluctuated greatly. Ukraine, many of the people who live there to this day, their culture is more like Russia, and their religion is more like Russia. But part of Ukraine, the religion is more like it is actually aligned with the Catholic Church, and so also aligned with the Polish. And so uh, uh, the Cossacks, you might have heard of them from Ukraine. They were, definitely more along. Putin is right in his big article he wrote about this, that their culture was more like Russia, and they were more aligned with Russia for many, many years. And the map has just changed a ton, and um, so they do feel, some Ukrainians do feel like we wish we were part of Russia still. I think, and there was evidence on both sides of saying they're being these kind of more culturally Russian Ukrainians, um, you know they wanted to be part of Russia perhaps. So Putin wishes that Ukraine had never become a country, never uh, split off from the Soviet Union, and yet it is a country recognized now, uh, and so he just decided to invade. Uh, you know,
Wow. Uh, did they give warnings? Did they send out millions of leaflets like the Israelis have done to the
well,
Ukrainians, telling them to leave and make phone
no, I think it was
calls?
more like threats and then kind of a surprise attack. Was the
Wow.
beginning of this Ukraine war, and it was an aggression. It wasn't. I mean, and so Ukraine has had to fight this a war of self defense against Russia, and they've definitely held their own. Uh, um, and so um, they think that Putin was planning this for a long time. Our American and other uh, intelligence said, they're preparing for a war. We could tell they were preparing for war, but we wanted to stop them and deter them from that. In my opinion, I mean, what could we have done to prevent the war from happening? That's hard to say. Um, but one of their demands was that, you know, Ukraine not join NATO. Uh, and they didn't give in on that. And so then that Putin says, well, that's going to be my justification for invading because I can't have
Wow.
them joining NATO, he said.
They don't want. Yeah, that was another reason he didn't want NATO that close to their borders,
Right.
with missiles aimed at their country.
Hmm. Do you remember what time period, Sean?
I want to say prior to the it's maybe it's the First World War, or
Prior to the First World
maybe.
War. Yeah. I mean, so some of those chains of alliances did lead to the First World War.
Oh wow.
And so um, if you're part of NATO and you get attacked, the other members of NATO, according to the treaties, we have to come to their defense. And
Okay.
so NATO was set up after World War II, the free countries in Europe to be in opposition to the communists who were you know uh, all over Eastern Europe.
Really?
Yeah, I
So it was
mean,
more of a political a different political structure, right? And that was the basis. The communist, which is it's not a Republican form of government in the sense of representation of the people, right?
Yeah,
Is that correct?
that's right. That's right. That's an odd thing about NATO is it started off as during the Cold War, free countries in Europe and the United States, North Atlantic Treaty Organization. But then, in some ways, NATO's reason for being, kind of went away after the fall of communism in the Soviet Union. But we continued NATO and we continued the treaties with those countries.
And we invaded Russia.
Yeah,
mean,
and
Russia.
as the communist element, disappeared from those countries. I mean, so
Right.
after World War II, the Soviet Union, kicked the Nazis out of all those places in Eastern Europe, but then they never took their troops out. And
Okay.
and so the Soviet military remained there and installed communist governments in Poland, where it never wanted communism, but it forced them to have that. In Romania, in just all the country, East Germany, all those countries. I mean, so then that's why they initially create NATO, is to oppose that communist bloc.
So let me ask you this. I think I just realized I was confusing the United Nations with
Yeah.
NATO. What is there some relationship between NATO and the United Nations?
Well, I mean, I think the United States is a leader in both of them, but UN doesn't have the power that a treaty like NATO has, where, I mean, if a country in the United Nations gets invaded, there's been one occasion where that happened and we actually got into a war to stop that. That's Korea,
Oh, wow.
And so in I think it's 48, South Korea got invaded by North Korea, and United Nations said, hey, we're trying to have peace, so we're all going to go in and stop that. So the United States was the main one who was part of that.
Wow.
It was a UN peacekeeping operation. But I would say the UN is much less powerful than it doesn't have that kind of teeth anymore, in part because we put China and Russia on the Security Council of the United Nations. And so it's not like a real treaty like NATO is, the United Nations.
Okay. And so what goes into a treaty?
Treaties must be created by presidents usually. The State Department will negotiate with the country if we want to have an official treaty with them. And then that gets confirmed by the U.S. Senate by a 2/3 vote. So the Senate and the president come up with these treaties and they sign off on them. And so
What makes them binding?
Well, what makes it binding is the United States doing that on our part, and then the other country ratifying it in their country. So both
So it kind of
countries
becomes like a
ratify that
law?
in their What's that?
So it becomes like a law in our countries?
Yeah, it becomes a law in both countries,
Oh,
and
okay.
in a mutual agreement that, and usually it is, that if they were to be invaded, that we would come to their aid.
Okay. And is it the executive branch that would enforce the treaties?
Yes,
Military, because
as the commander in chief.
Okay.
And so, there's also this thing in our Constitution, the Declare War Clause, that we're supposed to have Congress declare war before we do it. Now, in the 20th century, we only did that twice. All the other times that America has gone to war, the president has acted without a declaration of war. And that's happened hundreds of times. And so that's been a big problem as the United States has gotten more and more involved all over the world
Mm.
in peacekeeping operations. You know, what's to stop us from getting into conflicts we shouldn't be involved in? Remember, I mean, I was just talking about just war theory. Um, in some ways, that's mainly something that the president needs to think about, I think. But
Mm.
constitutionally,
Okay.
he's not being held by the Congress back from conflict unless Congress cuts off funding to a conflict, like it did in
Mm.
Vietnam.
They
There
have the
was not an
power to
official
curse.
declaration of war in Vietnam, but they gave funding to LBJ with the Gulf of Tonkin resolution in Congress. And
Wow.
then after Watergate, they cut off Congress cuts off funding for Vietnam. And that's basically how we leave Vietnam. It's just the funding gets cut off and sadly we flee, and then the North Vietnamese take over.
And what does that
Vietnam.
mean, like materially speaking? Uh, is it like a bank account that the president has? He has a debit
Yeah,
card where he can pay the military,
kind of
and
more
if
like a
there's no
slush fund, I
funds,
guess. Yeah, I mean, um, there's funding for the military that some, on a continuous basis. But then, if they're going to be, using forces, especially building up forces in a particular place, uh, then they usually get that funding, or sometimes also Congress will pass these things called authorization of the use of force resolution. Uh,
hmm,
and so that's not quite a declaration of war, but it's maybe giving a little bit more authorization. For example, they gave that to George W. Bush right after 9/11. Now, does that
hmm,
authorize him to invade Iraq? You know, I don't think so. But um, it's
it's a public affirmation of their uh, agreement for a military option to solve some problem,
mm,
so that maybe the public, we know that, oh well, the Congress is aligned with the president if he wants
right.
to.
And the thing is, Sean, I mean, I would say it's gotten really out of hand how much presidents have used their force. And after Vietnam,
Mm.
they tried to reel the presidents back in on this a bit. They passed something called the War Powers Act, which said if the president not just puts boots on the ground, but does any kind of military conflict, he needs to report to Congress within 48 hours that he's done that. And after he reports that, a clock is supposed to start, and he has 60 days to to bring the troops disengage after 60 days. Uh, and then he's supposed to automatically bring the troops home and disengage within 30 days after that.
Hmm.
Um, Now, no president, every president since the War Powers Act was passed has actually broken the War Powers Act and been involved in an engagement for more than 90 days. And so it's been totally ineffective. But Congress did that because they had been so ineffective at not doing an actual declaration of war when presidents had done this. But um, I wanted to
So
mention,
how is it that they can get away with? It must not be a law, though. I mean, is it a law or is it
correct.
not a law?
Most people think that if it were challenged, that that the president would probably win in court, uh, but they haven't. Congress has not actually wanted to challenge uh, to bring a challenge in court because they do think it'll be overturned
Mm.
and that the president would win if they did that. But it's kind of a crazy situation constitutionally. Basically, the president. I wouldn't say he has imperial powers, but I mean he he has a lot of war powers, way more than you know anybody else you'd have to say. And what's to rein him in? I mean, really, the best we can do, and actually something we should do is to try to hold the president to those just war theories,
Mm.
not engaging. I consider, um, I wanted to tell you about a doctrine that Colin Powell came up with. It's called the nickname is the Powell Doctrine, and he was trying to learn some lessons from Vietnam, and he said president should have followed these criteria in deciding whether he should engage in conflict or not. And this is a good book on this. Peter Rodman, he was an aide to Kissinger, uh, writes this book, Presidential Command. Um, but it's like 4 or 5 different things. This is 1984. The issue should be, if we get involved in a conflict, the issue should be vital to national interest. Once it committed, we should have a clear intention of winning. We need to have clearly defined objectives and send the forces needed to accomplish those objectives. The relationship between the objectives and the size of the forces should be reassessed continually. Before we commit, we should have some reasonable assurance of congressional and public support, and it should only be a last resort. I see that as very similar to the kind of just cause considerations in just war theory. And so Colin Powell came up with that and tried to apply it to the presidency. Now, have we followed the Powell Doctrine? Unfortunately, not much, but either, you know.
Okay. So I guess that raises a question in my mind. What powers does the Constitution give the president in terms of like military usage?
It's not, Article 2 of the Constitution is very short. And it just says, you know, he has the executive power and he's the commander in chief. And basically, presidents have acted and used the military from the beginning. And usually, though, if we were going to actually have a war with other states out there, we would have a declaration of war. One of the problems now is, Sean, is that we have non-state actors, terrorists, that we also are tracking down. It's not like an actual government we're going to fight against. And perhaps that helps us think about the Israel situation a little bit. Is,
okay.
I mean, that wasn't like the army of the PLO that was attacking necessarily. It was these Hamas terrorists, basically, who, you know, kidnapped and killed those people in Israel.
Well, but some people say, well, I guess in Gaza, Hamas is the political authority. When they came to power in, I think it was the 90s, where they had a violent takeover for power, and they threw the other leaders off of buildings. But since that time, the Hamas has ran the Gaza Strip, and apparently they have a political wing and they have a military wing, and it was the military wing who invaded Israel, from what I understand.
Well, I might disagree on that, Sean, because I mean,
okay,
they've got an actual like more official leaders for the Palestinians. Like Arafat was the leader of the Palestinian Authority, so West Bank, Gaza, and the Palestinian areas in Israel. And so Hamas, though, and Hezbollah and some of these other groups, you're right that they are, for all intents and purposes, the political authority there, but they're still not of the status of a state. They're still considered to be, you know, non-state actors, terrorist groups, quite a bit, you know. And so...
And why is that?
Well, to become an actual recognized state, you got to have other countries, for one thing, recognize you, and then you have to kind of get into some formal legal relationships. And, you know, Hamas has not done that. You know, they've very much gone with, you know, attacking. So it'll be. Do you want to talk about Israel some?
Yeah, because I think we've entered into the Israel conversation when we introduce Hamas, but let me ask you this: Hamas supposedly has a charter and in that charter, it lists the destruction of Israel, and so just from listening to, I mean, I've gathered the impression as though Gaza is a state. It's a state that is dependent on, in the sense that they have leadership. They voted on their leaders. Apparently, they voted on the Palestinians voted for Hamas to take charge, and Hamas is in charge. But what I hear you saying is that although they are the governors, so for example, they took hostages into the hospital in Shifa, and the when you would hear a report, you would hear the report saying the Hamas ran medical district or center says that this is how many people have died, and the commentators have been quick to note that it's their whole medical institution is ran by Hamas, is governed by Hamas. So,
and you're not supposed to do that as a government, to have, military stuff in hospitals like that.
right.
And so that's another reason why. I mean, Sean, I don't think that Hamas is really the recognized government by anybody over there.
Really?
No, it's the Palestinian Authority that's, I think, the actual government.
Okay.
Supposed to be for Gaza and the West Bank.
Okay. For
So
both, because
it,
Biden has just recently said that he thinks that a refurbished Palestinian Authority should take over after Hamas is removed.
yes.
To me, that implies that Hamas is not in charge. I mean, that the Palestinian Authority is not in charge. And
They have not. They've been very weak in terms of policing groups like Hamas. In
but
some
they
ways,
were supposed to be in charge. Is that what you're
yes,
saying?
they were supposed to be in charge.
I wonder. So I wonder if it was the PLO leaders or reps who were thrown off the buildings in the 90s.
Where was that?
In the Gaza Strip, supposedly the PLO threw the the Hamas, once they took power in the 90s, they threw the, look it up,
PLO officials off.
That's what I'm thinking from what you're saying. Like if they're supposed to be in charge, then that I would have a suspicion that the people that they got rid of were the PLO reps who were also in the Gaza Strip.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, from the longer history here, my perspective on it is that, they, in the 90s, they were talking about having a two-state solution, and having Gaza and West Bank really become like a real government with a much stronger PLO as the actual government. But that hasn't really happened, and in part, it was mainly the PLO that didn't want it, actually. Or sorry, it's not mainly the PLO. It was mainly the Palestinians who didn't want it and were more on joining some of these groups like Hamas. Going back to like 1948, when Israel began to be recognized as the government, the state of Israel. I would even trace it back even before 48, because what we have, I think, is I think that I'm much more on the Israeli side of this, I'd have to say, Sean, because the way I see it is going back to the end of World War One, actually. At the end of during World War One, it was a war between Turkey, Germany, and Austria against, you know, America, England, and everybody else in World War One. You know, but the Ottoman Turkish Empire owned Israel basically at that time. That was the government there before World War One.
Mm-hmm.
Now there were Jewish Zionists also living in the Ottoman Empire, and they helped out the British against the Turks. And
Really?
the prime minister at the time, Balfour, he said, okay, if you help us out, we will create a state of Israel where Jewish people can live in Israel. And
so how did they help out militarily?
Yes,
they fight?
There was actually like a brigade that helped out the British to beat the Turks.
Where?
And what's up?
Where did they fight?
In Israel, and
really?
So, yeah.
Wow.
And so after World War One, that part of the Turkish Ottoman Empire, part of it, Syria went to the French, and then Israel went to the British. But instead of, immediately turning it over to the Zionist Jews and having it become a state, the British kind of like held on to it as a protectorate until 1948. And then they turned it over.
That's when they pulled out.
Yeah, they pull out in 1948, and they said, well, okay, there's obviously lots of Arabs and Muslims who live here. You're going to, we're going to have, some kind of peace agreement with these different groups, but we're going to pull out and turn it over to the Israelis in 1948. And it's going to happen, and there's going to be some areas that will continue to be Arab Muslim areas, and then the rest will be Jewish areas, Israel, and as like the exact hour that they pull out in 1948, like at the stroke of midnight, these guys from the Muslim Arab side immediately attack the Jewish settlements all over the country.
Okay.
All over the country. So they did not accept a peace agreement from the beginning.
Wow. So I've been hearing this, and there's so much. I've watched a lot of debates about from many Jews and Arabs, admittedly liberal Jews and Arabs, who say things like Israel, they're occupiers, like it's an the occupation,
mm-hmm.
and the apartheid state, things like that, and then when you listen to the recounts of history from the different sides, they say, well, the Jews, what are the Antifada? I think that's one. The Nakba, the Nakba is something they call it, and I've heard it said that this is when the Jews drove millions of Palestinians from their homes and began to live in their homes. And so me hearing these different discussions, I go back to how we to ascertain who's telling the truth in these conversations, or who's inventing facts to make their case for them, because I know it's history, and just like life is complex, that you may have some Jews who actually killed some Arabs because they hated them.
Mm-hmm.
No one is a person's character is not depending on the color of their skin. You have bigots within every race and group of people. And so when people say stories about, Jews, they burnt down Arabs' villages and killed the people in there, like, that's not unbelievable or anything like that. But I still know that people tend to believe a lot of times what they, you believe the narrative that fits in with your worldview. if you don't have this prior commitment to being objective and really knowing what's true. So how do we ascertain the facts of history? And it goes back to me with the historical method. And it's like, I don't have time to learn to be a historian. You know?
It's
Yeah.
This is true. I mean, um, from my perspective, you remember I was bringing up the natural law, or and the just war theory ideas of just war and just cause and justice in war. Now, I think that the Israelis have, the way they've conducted war at times has violated just war theory in terms of the conduct of war. Um, they, don't they don't follow a lot of the same things that America would, for example, in the way that they actually fight the war. And so I would disagree with them, some of the conduct of the Israelis, but in terms
I've
of,
recently heard, just quickly, I've recently heard that I listened to a lot of English Israeli news, that they do it they broadcast it in English just to keep up with what's going on. And I heard some commentators on this particular station, I think they call Israel 2024 Israel, or Israel 24, and this YouTube channel. But the commentators were intelligence officers and former military commanders and colonels and things like that. But they were just commenting on the differences of rules in the Middle East as opposed to the West. And they were saying, yeah, Jews were Middle Easterns. We're Middle Easterners, so we speak a different language than the West. And I heard prior to this war, I had heard Benjamin Netanyahu say, uh, Netanyahu. I don't know why I'm saying who, something, who. It sounds different now that I'm saying
BB.
it.
We just call him BB.
BB. Let's call him BB. But I heard him say that if if someone attacks their policy is, if you attack them, if you hit them, they hit you harder.
Yeah, it's
and so
so just war theory would say disproportionate. That's you're not supposed to do
right.
something disproportionate. Yeah,
Right, but that, I remember hearing him say that, and at the time it made sense. I mean, you get it. You want to discourage them from doing it, but if a person is willing to kill themselves for their beliefs, then maybe they won't care about you killing other people.
yeah, and that could start a real cycle of violence. I mean,
Right.
that's
Which,
so as a Christian, it's this is another reason why I see this as all that can be the problem. I mean, in terms of like Israel's right to be in existence as a state, I'm 100% on that. But sometimes the conduct of what they're doing, that's the one area where I'm like, okay, I understand responding, but when it's disproportionate or possibly killing civilians, then that's where I have the problem. Yeah.
right. And I've heard people say that, or suggest rather, that the response can't be proportionate because the initial attack by Hamas was immoral. I mean, they raped women, they murdered citizens, and that Israel, if they're to be a just nation, aligned with international law and et cetera, the rules of humanity, that they can't just go target a bunch of, can't send the biggest bomb. But I was thinking today about the bomb that America dropped on Japan.
Yeah.
I know that must have killed babies and
Well, Sean, you're exactly right. That's why Elizabeth Anscombe, one of my favorite Catholic moral philosophers, she said it wasn't according to just war theory that we dropped the bomb like that. We shouldn't have done that, actually. So when Truman
Right.
visited Oxford, and Truman visited Cambridge, she wrote a whole thing like going after Truman.
Mm.
It's kind of Mr. Truman's degree was the name of her big like article on that. But so that there was that movie that came out over the summer, Oppenheimer, talking about the dropping the bomb. And so it's, especially the second one, Nagasaki. There's some serious questions, I think, in terms of the disproportion. And you know, the nuclear thing that makes this whole situation with Russia more complicated too.
Mm.
You know, so that I think does play into both the Ukrainians and Ukraine's allies not wanting to actually take the war to Russia, because if you escalate it and you take the war to Russia, it might go nuclear, and then you've got actually much more damage would be caused than possibly not going to war to do that.
I wonder why don't the Russians just take their fighter jets and fly towards the capital of Ukraine and just blow it up? It seems like they're
I
moving
think they've.
from.
I mean, I that's a good question. I mean, I guess they can't.
So that you think they've tried, but they've just been failing.
Yeah,
Oh wow, that's pretty
because they've
impressive.
definitely been using air power, you know, but
Okay.
we've been giving the Ukrainians a lot of support, but they
Right.
haven't used nuclear weapons yet. And apparently, this is another interesting thing that they bring up in that book I mentioned, Presidential Command. One of the things that presidents will also do is, besides the formal channels of the State Department, you know, the ambassadors and everything, there's also sometimes back channels. And apparently, Biden and his national security advisors and national security committee, they have back channels with the Russians. And even
Mm.
as the war was starting, they said, listen, we don't want this to go nuclear. You know, we're going to oppose you. But, you know, so that that was something that was leaked, I think, recently, that Biden has had talks with the Russians, you know, through a back channel to ensure that the conflict did not become nuclear.
Back channel meaning uh, a source that is not publicly disclosed
No, no. So back
in
channels
terms
would
of a
be
person.
just just the president or someone extremely close to the president and Putin, not going through any of the formal channels.
Oh, oh wow.
That's
So
a
like a
back channel. So the
direct
first one
contact.
to really do this in our modern times was Kennedy. During the Cuban Missile Crisis, his brother Bobby Kennedy had a back channel with, I think his name was Dobrynin, the someone extremely high up in the Soviet leadership, saying, "Listen, we're about to cause a nuclear war. You've got to get those missiles out of Cuba." And they actually, the back channel worked, and they were able to do it that way. Um, so there's also some of those things going on too that the president's involved in, that are not even the official channels.
Okay. And wouldn't the use of a nuclear bomb, because I heard, it seems like I've even heard Biden say that if the Russians used nuclear weapons, that's a declaration of war.
That's that's
Like
probably
at
the end of
which
the world, to be honest with you.
right, right, but he said that he said it with so much confidence that he hadn't made other statements with the same level of confidence. And he was saying this, and Ukraine is not even a NATO country, but he was saying if they use nuclear weapons, or maybe confuse. No, I think that was right. And then I've heard others heard him say the same thing about chemical weapons. He says if they use chemical weapons, then that's another red line. So what's the big deal with chemical weapons? Why would that involve all of us? I mean,
Mhm.
if you die, you die. Like, what's the
Well, That's a good. I don't. I don't know. That's a good question, but I think you used the exact correct terminology there. Red line. He's trying to deter them from doing that, and so
Mm,
he's saying, don't cross this line, or we'll do a response.
right.
Um, and it
Seems
was
like Putin would
ineffective to
know that
stop them.
too.
What's up?
It seems like Putin would know that too. I mean, you have to know that if you use nuclear weapons and everyone around the world has nuclear weapons, we're all dying. Like we're
Yep,
all going to be
mutually
trying to.
assured destruction.
Right. It's like, well, hey, we're going to go out, which raises another issue. And to me, I thought about this today, but I have not heard anyone say this. They It's been said that Hamas attacked Israel because Israel was they were in talks with
Yeah.
Saudi Arabia
Yep.
for a peace accord agreement. But I was thinking today, what if Iran had Hamas to attack because they're so close to their nuclear weapon, and they've heard Israel say time after time and time. I mean, Netanyahu went to the United Nations, and I remember the bomb he drew on the board, and he's like, "This the red line. Once they get here to this 90%, like it's over." He said, "We will not." He said, "Our promise is we will not be the first person to introduce a nuclear weapon in the Middle East." So, like, as if they've been kind of coy about whether they have whether Israel has nuclear weapons, but I've heard many people say that it's kind of like a known fact. And when Netanyahu said that, it's like he suggested, like, I'm gonna let you make an inference. We're not gonna pull ours out first, but if you do,
Hmm.
we do. And so I was thinking, the thought occurred to me today: what if Iran? Because prior to this war, we were hearing more and more reports that Iran, I guess, what was the centrifuges? They were developing them and
Yeah.
enriching their uranium to the point to where, oh, now they can start a power plant, and pretty soon they could start they can build a bomb. And then we have this war, and everyone thinks, oh, well, it's because we're getting close to Saudi Arabia, the peace accord. And I was thinking, what if it's really because they were getting close and they knew Israel was going to attack them, so they started the war to distract Israel from uh, focusing on them primarily while they build this bomb in their underground uh, facilities. And that
I
was
mean,
a
that definitely
disturbing
could be
thought.
true. I mean, Iran, they are a big troublemaker for us and all our allies just all over the place now. I mean, and it was on the anniversary of the Yom Kippur War,
Mm,
the 50th anniversary, and which was like the Vietnam basically for Israel in 1973. Really bad war for them. And you know the uh, Iran, going back to the Obama years, I mean, we've had this kind of semi-treaty with Iran where we're giving them billions of dollars to not build nuclear weapons, but they probably still are, you know, and um, and that actually brings up the earlier question about treaties. Obama wanted this agreement with the Iranians without an official confirmation from the U.S. Senate, which, if it's a real treaty, they're supposed to get confirmation. But it was
mm.
just, um, you know, just the president doing that. And so that's always been part of the problem with that deal was it's not an official treaty of the United States that we were supposed to give them all that money. But, um, and so uh, definitely could be possible linkage there with Iran and Hamas is what a lot of people think. Um, but
What
no.
about military funding?
Mhm.
This is a term that I hear in the media quite frequently now. It's like, oh, we're giving this country military funding, and in some contexts, it sounds as if they're talking about actual dollars. but then in other, it sounds like it's equipment. Is it? uh, Is there a distinction there, or are they the same?
Um, well, I think with I think it's um, usually money, but we also will make some agreements to sell some countries weapons. For example, Taiwan and and Israel uh, weapons as well. You know the Germans were supposed to sell a lot of the weapons to Ukraine.
Hmm.
And so um, this funding though for these other countries in their conflicts, that's almost the main power Congress has if it wants to. You know, they don't declare war that much anymore. They mainly just say we'll fund something or not.
Okay. Okay. Yeah, and especially the Ukrainians, it sounds like you hear, well, we gave them anti tank missiles and drones and things like that they which seems to be specific, equipment from the government. And I began to wonder if America can give a country 100 billion, dollars worth of equipment or money for free.
Yeah.
Why?
But maybe they'll pay
Like,
us back someday. I don't know.
right?
Or-
Without it become I began to wonder about the values of different individuals. Like
yeah. Oh yeah.
say take social programs. You give this lady right here, she gets food stamps, free money for groceries, and somebody else gets free money for, like, I guess, a check through welfare and things like that. And you hear people say, "Oh, we can't spend that on they need to contribute." Right. And it was like, well, what about these other countries? And a lot
Yeah.
of these politicians, they're like, no, we need to give them $100 billion. And it's like, you can wipe out all college loans with a
Yeah.
hundred billion
Yeah.
of dollars.
I mean, so the United States, we used to be much more isolationist. Um, that's been the main tradition in uh, American foreign policy
Really?
until World War One. And then after World War One, we had a huge shift with Woodrow Wilson. He said, "We're going to make the world safe for democracy,"
Mm.
and so that, I mean, that's just a total shift from what the main tradition has been. And people say isolationism, that's bad. Well, no, I mean, actually, I don't think so. I mean, it's meant if we usually get involved in wars and then shut everything down and don't do any war stuff for a long time. And then, yes, it would take us a long time to get geared up for a war again. And that's been one of the main criticisms of mainly being isolationist. But I mean, I think there was a lot of wisdom to the founding fathers like Washington. In his farewell address, he says we should avoid European engagements that don't have anything to do with us. Um, I mean, another country might be a
Is
democracy,
that a
but
conservative view?
that doesn't mean we have to join them every time.
Is
Um,
that a conservative view?
yes, yes, and
Okay.
then John Quint, and then the Monroe Doctrine was the same thing. We're mainly going to try to stay in our hemisphere. And then we had actually John Quincy Adams. One of my friends just wrote a essay uh, called "The Adams Triangle." My friend Ben Judge in the
Huh.
New Criterion. Um, Same kind of thing, trying to mainly stay out of conflicts. I mean, and I think that goes along with just war theory to me. Is in general, the bias should be toward not doing war. You know, the burden of proof should be on you if you're going to start a war. And so that might seem isolationist, but um, in generally, I think that's what I much more agree with than what Woodrow Wilson said, which is, we're going to spread democracy around the world and
Oh, that's scary.
get in all these fights and wars. I mean, and the criticism is, well, what about World War II when Hitler was? I mean, how could we be isolationists? You know, and
Okay,
and sure,
that's a good point.
that's one where uh, it was right to be involved in that, but to fight against Hitler, of course.
Right.
But
Much too late, in my
Hitler,
opinion.
once he starts breaking the law and breaking treaties and invading Poland and doing all the stuff he did, I mean, he actually has given you a reason to start a war. You know,
Let me ask you
uh,
something about Hitler. Did we know he had killed that many Jews before we got into the war? Or is it like something we found out?
oh, I think we knew. Yeah, there's a guy Tarski
Wow.
who went to FDR very early on and said he's got these concentration camps going. I escaped from one, and so they knew it.
Oh wow.
They knew it very early. Yeah.
So that's too little, too late, in my opinion. I mean,
Especially on like the British part. The British apparently there were boats that were going to go to Israel. People trying to escape, and they would not allow immigration to
oh
Israel.
wow.
And now, not Churchill. Churchill, opposed that. And he said, "No, what are we doing? They're gonna, we have to stop Hitler." But anyway, so that's one, of course, where isolationism didn't make sense, and I don't think that was clearly a just war to stop Hitler and to stop the Japanese after they bombed Pearl Harbor and everything. Um, but after World War II, though, we take this much more, imperial kind of approach where we are just going all over the world to try to stop communism, and getting involved in all kinds of conflicts we didn't used to get involved in. And that's part of the reason I brought up all that stuff about what's actually going to constrain a president, or constrain our government when it seems like the president can just do what he wants in terms of starting conflicts.
So do you think that was a reaction to the world wars when we fought like communist countries and things like that? And it's like, oh, communism is bad. Like we need to preemptively, fight wherever we see it.
Part of it's that, Sean, but it's also that the British were no longer the ones, you know, in charge of world trade, taking care of the oceans anymore. The British Empire kind of, you know, falls apart. They give up their colonies after World War II as well, and then it's like everybody's looking around. Who's the main one, keeping trade free, keeping everybody free? It's like, oh, America, and so everybody starts looking to
Mm.
us, and so that there's that. But then also we are trying to stop the communism from spreading as well. And so between those two things, America's
So
just
we
been
become Big
involved
Brother.
all over.
So in a sense, we become Big Brother.
Yes.
Uh,
Yes. And so that's a total change from the way America used to be in terms of mainly trying to stay out of stuff.
mm.
Um, and so uh, how do we balance that more conservative, stay out of wars that with helping countries that, you know, um, we have commitments to. Uh, that's the challenge.
Let's talk about international law. That's something I've heard. Uh, I've heard a lot with this recent war with Israel and Hamas. I've heard it said that, oh, you all need to obey international law. These are war crimes. You need to be tried for war crimes. Then I heard from the Israelis that uh, they have been more careful and more uh, 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 evidently seeking to preserve the life of civilians than any other military in the world. And they mention all the millions of leaflets that they drop, and you see video footage of them dropping leaflets that says, "Hey, go south." And they mention about the phone calls they've made, and then they mention no other country has done this when they went to war. Uh, and so international law, what is it and why is it binding to countries? Because I've heard Netanyahu say we're going to abide by international law. Like, why do they care about what some governing board outside of their country thinks you should
Right.
do? And
It's less law than the law of a country. In the old days they used to call it jus gentium, the law of the peoples, and it's just kind of the normal expectations for how different countries are supposed to deal with each other. And you can have some countries that are just way out of bounds that don't follow international law, and so the UN mainly was the body of countries that was supposed to maintain international agreements, international law. And so, law itself, what's the definition of law? It's something, binding people together, something that's promulgated, it has a legitimate authority, and it's an ordinance of reason for the common good. That's the definition from Aquinas of what a law is.
oh,
And
wow.
so, who's the lawgiver for international law? It's really like an agreement between countries, but in terms of who's the enforcer of international law, who's the judge for a disagreement. We have an international law court called The Hague in the Netherlands, but people don't necessarily follow what their court says on things, but it's mainly enforced by countries that follow international law. And so it's a little bit. So I'd say it's less law than law in the country itself.
And I've heard it said recently that they wanted to try Putin as a war criminal because of the Ukrainian invasion, and I was wondering in my head, why would Putin care? Like, how would that affect him? Would he not be able to sleep at night? Because I mean, doesn't
Right.
he live in the Kremlin and so it sounds like it's a bunch of show. It's just it's more symbolic than it is an actual material consequence for Putin. Yeah. So I guess what do you think about Israel? Do you think they're occupiers?
No, I
Is it
think
an
they're a legitimate
occupation?
country. Yeah, I
Okay.
mean, and the Arabs. I mean, there's actually still hundreds of thousands of Arabs, Muslims who live in Israel, and the ones who live in Israel, they're way better off than the ones who live in the West Bank or in Gaza, and so there was of course land taken and things like that at the very beginning, but I mean some of that I don't think there's anything that can be done about that.
Right. It
It's
seems like they mention when you look at documentaries about that kind of try to show Israel in a negative light, you usually see the border crossings from Israel into Gaza and from Gaza into Israel, because apparently prior to this attack they would let up to I think 40,000 Gazans could come to Israel to work.
yeah.
But and
You know
if you
what, Sean?
see
I
that,
actually did that. I did that into the West Bank
oh, you
when
did?
I was in Israel this summer.
How was it?
So I
Yeah,
was
talk to us
our
about that.
hotel. Our hotel was in Bethlehem. So we were staying in the West Bank,
Oh, wow.
and there was a border crossing into Israel right by our hotel. And there's a Jewish holy site, and it's also a Christian holy site called the Tomb of Rachel, or the Tomb of Rachel, as they call it over there. and so it's supposed to be where the Old Testament, uh, you know, woman from the Old Testament, Rachel, is buried.
Rachel
Um,
and Leah, who would have been
wives of Jacob, wives of Jacob.
Jacob, Israel,
Right,
Israel, and Leah had more of the kids, and Rachel was Joseph's mother, and I forget what Joseph's brother was. It Benjamin?
right. First
Uh,
7 years. Right.
yeah,
Yeah. So that's the tomb of Rachel, and um, and so
sounds like a
it's one of
stretch.
like
How
just
would they do that?
four or five really holy sites to the Jews. And I was like, where the heck is this place? I see it on the Google Maps, and they're like, well, you have to go do a border crossing to get in there. And so, I mean, this place was walled up like a fortress, um, and and so I had to go through the place where the workers from the West Bank, they would go through this huge, it's like a border crossing to Mexico practically, to go in. And they found out I flashed the U.S. passport. It's like, oh yeah, go right ahead, like, um, and so it's kind of crazy to go in there. I was definitely out of place, in both areas. I was Because when I was walking over there, I kind of wandered into a Palestinian camp, and there's kids like circling around me like sharks. I was like, I got to get out of here, because I'm just an outsider. And then I was an outsider among the Jews at the tomb of Rachel, but it was an eye-opening experience. But I'm sure all that's just closed off now.
Wow. Yeah, I guess what I was thinking of, I was reflecting on the visceral effect of watching the thick wall and watching the person come from one side of the border to another, until I thought about it. If you look at both places as different countries, what country doesn't have some type of uh, border so you can know who's coming into your country, right? If you think about it in those terms, if you think about it in terms of one state, right? Al
Mm-hmm.
Gaza is a part of Israel. West Bank is a part of Israel. If you think about it in those terms, then you start saying, well, why are those walls there, right? Because now it
Yes.
seems like segregation. But if
Right.
you realize, no, that this there is their domain and this is Israel's domain, and they have walls protecting. And
Mm-hmm.
just like you said, if you were going to the border of Mexico, it wouldn't just be a free free path to go there. You had to go. I think we crossed some border. I crossed some border when I was driving somewhere, but they had they had guns and they had
Yeah.
rifles, and I was like, hey, how y'all doing, brothers? It's coming through. And he said, okay, go on. And I was like, wow, this is pretty serious here. Uh, but I didn't feel like I was being discriminated against. I felt like that, to me, it's common sense. You put up
Mm-hmm.
this is why our houses have walls and don't just have
Right. Right. I mean, and so I
openings.
mean, that's because, like, I mean, they have it's almost a it's almost a two-state solution, but they haven't really. Palestine has not become a real second state, but it's like almost there because they've got other Arab towns within Israel that aren't walled up, but
Mm.
they've come up with this agreement. They said this will be, um, the part.
Section A, B, and C,
Yeah,
that kind of
exactly.
thing. I think I heard someone mention the breakdown of that. Like this section would be for the Arabs, this section would be for the Jews, and this section will be like for Israel's military to pass. I think B section is so that Israel's military can get through, and A is for the Arabs, and C is for the
and
Jews.
and within Jerusalem itself, there's still the Arab quarter, and I mean the Muslims are in charge of the Temple Mount. That was a decision after 1967 to say in the Six Day War, like, okay, they took over all that area, but they said, but we're gonna let you guys have this back. The
Right.
Jordanians, they said, put you in charge of this. They also took over the Golan Heights, and they didn't give that back because the Golan Heights were being used to shoot um, mortars on Israelis all over that area up near
And the
Lebanon.
Sinai too, right? They took over the Sinai and gave that to the Egypt.
Correct, back to the Egyptians. Um, what if you're a Christian visiting Israel though? It's really nice though that they took over the Golan Heights because that's where Cesare Philippi is actually, um, where several parts of the gospel happen at
Oh,
that
really?
place.
It's in the
Yeah,
Golan Heights.
right
Wow.
there.
Oh,
And we
wow.
wouldn't have been able to go there. Without going into Jordan before, but
Right. Yeah, that's interesting. And so I've just been wondering about like the differences between that. And once you think, to me, contextually and historically, when you think about 6 million Jews were murdered, if there's any race on earth that needs their, I don't know, are Jews, or that's that a race? What is that? That's another question. Like, what is
right.
it? I mean,
Well,
they look
yeah,
white.
there's just
Jews
been
look white, but what are they?
anti-Semitism. It's just been one of the worst. There's just a recurring anti-Semitism throughout all of history. I think it is inspired by the devil.
I
He doesn't like the people of
Right,
God, uh,
right.
and and so that's another reason I think to support Israel.
Right,
Is
right. I tend to think it's, how else can you explain that? You
you
can't
can't
say it's
because
because they're
it's
dark, their
actually.
skin is
There's
dark.
other kinds of racism that are evil, but anti-Semitism is like a special kind of irrational evil. That it's just. Some things just don't even make sense by the normal
People hate
thinker.
Jews and they can't even identify them a lot of times.
Yeah.
It's like, oh, I hate Jews, but I like you. Oh, you're a Jew. Oh, okay, I hate you now. Like it's the most ridiculous, you
Yeah.
know. For a white person to be discriminated against because they are Jewish is the most bizarre. It's like, blonde eye, blonde hair, blue eyed, uh, Jewish person who's hated because of their, I want to say, nationality. I don't know what to call the Jewishness, ethnicity. Maybe it's a combination of their genetic relationship to to previous Jews who lived in the land of Israel. But for I mean, just the it makes no sense. So I think they need a safe haven.
Yeah.
To me, that's logical. And then when you hear about uh, persecution of different non-Muslim religious groups within Muslim countries, of then it's like, well, if you can't stay there, where are you going to go? You went to Europe,
Right.
you were murdered in Europe, millions of you were killed. Then you went to the Arab countries, and they killed you. Uh, so where are you gonna go? You got this homeland here. Go back there, and it does seem as if a lot of the conversation about Israel Hamas, uh, it's a lot of naivete on the side of the Westerners and Americans when it comes to a failure to understand that a lot of Palestinians may not share the same values as we do. Like we value democracy, and so we can. It's easy to project your democratic values on people who are across the sea and who have a different idea of what government should be. It should be a theocracy. Sharia law should rule. Everyone should submit to the will of Allah, et cetera, et cetera. And if you don't understand that mindset, because all of the Muslims you've met have been American Muslims who are like, hey, let's go out to eat, you know.
Yeah.
I mean, they're raised in this culture, so they're culturally they're American. They
Mhm.
have not been socialized in an Islamic Middle Eastern Islamic mentality, and not to say that every Palestinian thinks that, but I put it to you like this: where if there are 40,000 Palestinians who are in Hamas, then each of those 40,000 they have families. Those families are either going to support them or not support them, and most likely they're going to support them. When you look at video footage of someone in Hamas saying, "Hey, mom and dad, I killed 10 Jews," that you cannot, the American mind, my mind cannot process that. The video footage of taking the body of someone you kidnapped from Israel and murdered, and driving around in the truck and celebrating with in
It's like
public.
Somalia. Yeah.
That this mind can't understand how that's not uh abnormal psychology. I
Yeah.
mean, like a psychopath. Like,
Yes.
and to me, if you're celebrating, you can look at a body. What does life mean to you? And I was telling a student of mine, I was asking her rather, and this student frankly told me that her religion teaches that if someone has done something to you, that you have to retaliate. And this student was a, a Muslim student, and so the student began to show me pictures of Muslim kids, civilians who were killed,
Hmm.
and she was like, "What do you think about that?" I said, "I think that's horrible."
Yeah.
I say, "Let me ask you a question. Look at that picture. What if she was Jewish?"
Yeah.
And the student couldn't even, she could not uh
Golden
acknowledge that
rule.
her death would be bad, or and then she told me she didn't think Hamas were terrorists. They were resistance fighters. And I was like, well, do you think it's bad for them to go murder innocent people who had nothing to do? Who are you resisting? Right? If the person who's just in their house, how am I harming you? But what I've seen from other Palestinian pro Hamas supporters is that the very existence of Jews on the land is a form of occupation.
Yeah.
So it's a form of violence in their mind. So that it some kind of way it legitimizes their death. Their if you kill them in the minds of these Palestinians, and this student wasn't even from Palestine, but the student was Muslim, and it just showed me. It was like with this, I was saying, well, what is the value of a life?
Yeah.
How
Yeah.
could why do you expect me to feel bad for this little girl who died in an Israeli airstrike, but you don't feel bad for a little Jewish girl who was killed by Hamas? And I was saying, well, if we value life, then we have to feel bad for
Yeah.
both people. And she couldn't. Her worldview would not allow that.
Hmm.
And I was just in complete and utter shock.
Hmm.
And I'm like, I didn't know
Yeah.
what to think about it or what to
Yeah.
say about it.
I didn't have any students who got in arguments with me about that, but I did have some students with like bumper stickers, "Free Palestine" and stuff like that. And I'm just like, interesting, you know. But
Yeah.
in terms of the valuing the life, I mean, that goes both for Palestinians and the Jews. I, I was proud of the Catholic bishop over there in Israel. He's got a great name. He's an Italian. His name is uh, Pizza Balla. Is the guy's name Pizza Balla? But Pizza Balla, I mean, he's gone out of his way to say, you know, We got Christians who are Arabs, and we don't want them killed, and we've got Christians in Israel, and we don't want them killed. We got and we don't want Muslims killed, and we don't want Jews killed. And so it was pretty impressive. He said, I would be willing to substitute myself for one of these hostages if you want to do it. He said that like an official letter. So I was like, that's pretty impressive to say that. I mean, to actually follow through on it would be crazy. But I'm just thinking about what a Christian response would be, to some of this.
I don't know. So when I looked at the attacks, I kind of thought it was overkill, but then I remembered like this is their modus operandi in Israel. Like they're gonna make you pay.
Mm-hmm.
I think the idea is if we show weakness, then we can't. Like I would hear Netanyahu say quite often that the mistake that Jews made in previous centuries were not to take threats against their existence seriously. And when people said we're going to destroy all of you, they're not taking it serious and just staying in those European countries. And he says, so we take it serious. So if you say if you try to harm us, we're gonna over respond in a sense, which I get that, but I still think that it was collective punishment in the sense, and I was thinking, what should they have done? What would have been the best? I think precision guided missiles, because apparently they weren't using the precision guided missiles. They were just using the the city block destroyers.
Yeah.
Boom, boom, boom.
Right.
And then I think Elon Musk made an excellent point when he said, for every strike, how many Hamas fighters are you creating?
Yeah, that's true.
And I don't know how they're gonna, because when that northern Gaza is completely destroyed, how are the Palestinians going to go back to those destruction zones and not feel more hate for the Israelis than they ever have?
I mean, you could feel it over there, and I was just like, just walking down the street, you just see people saying stuff to each other, and it's just like, I am glad that I live in a country with a lot of Christians in it. I mean, I know Christians can be hateful like that too.
Yeah.
Or drivers in Houston sometimes. But I do think there's something to saying that you're supposed to pray for your enemies and not try to make more of them, by hitting them back harder, and that's something that I think Christianity gets, and that's something to be proud of, I think.
Right. Violence begets violence.
Yes.
But I completely understand their objectives. I'm in a complete agreement with. I think Hamas needs to be destroyed, but one thing you cannot kill with a bomb is an ideology.
Yeah.
And that ideology they've already lived many of their lives immersed in Jew hatred culture and things like that. And now they have a lot more evidence to point to. If somebody was on the fence about whether Jewish, people were, or the Israelis were against them or, hateful or whatever, now they can be like, look, they killed all my family members. Everybody died in that strike. But tough issues,
Yeah.
very difficult issues to.
Yeah.
You can't win from losing with Prime Benjamin Netanyahu, who BB has some the most difficult decisions, I think, and the like many people have said this is completely unprecedented. It had no memory in history of these events, so it's like it's nothing to go off of, no precedent. But thanks, Chris. I think we've gone for a really long time.
Yeah, John. Yeah, we can cut some of this. I mean, some of this,
yeah. I
but
think I may include it, but you let
it
me
was
know.
a good discussion though. I enjoyed it.
Yeah, I did as well. But I want to include the entire thing. I think this is very good material. But yeah, so thank you all for watching the Thought Decoders Podcast. I'm Sean Mixon, and today we've decoded the politics of war with Professor Dr. Christopher Wolfe. And I always thank you, Dr. Wolfe, for coming on. Appreciate your expertise. And for those of you who are watching, we thank you for getting to the end of this podcast. And we hope you've been illuminated on some of these discussions, some of the difficulties and ideas as we grasp at truth. If doing so in the dark or without the greatest amount of light, we still make the attempt. But thank you again, and always remember to think better.